Hello and welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody. Welcome back to Fallout, where today we're going to be taking a look at the history of the 44 Magnum and how that's kind of changed throughout the world of Fallout. So the 44 Magnum is actually not in the very first Fallout game. I always thought that it was, but it's not. It doesn't appear until Fallout 2. There is actually a 44 in the first Fallout game, but that's the Desert Eagle. And that gun would make an appearance again in a couple other games. It would appear at least in Fallout 2. I'm pretty sure it also appeared in Fallout Tactics, and you could argue that it appeared in Fallout 3 and New Vegas as the 10mm pistol too, since it's clearly modeled after a Desert Eagle. And it shows up actually really early on into Fallout 2, where it's pretty much like the third town that you go to in Fallout 2, assuming that you're playing the game normally and you're not skipping ahead to certain areas, because usually you'll start out in your home village, then you'll head over to Clamnith, which is like the first town that you start in. That gets you some of your first and really only guns that you have at that point, because there's none in your starting village. There's not a whole lot there either. There's like pipe rifles, 10mm pistol, and then once you get to the next town over, then there's a merchant there that frequently sells the 44 Magnum. And in terms of stats, the 44 Magnum is actually quite stacked compared to the other guns that we've got, where this one does 24 to 36 damage, averaging 30 damage a shot, which is very good. This costs 4 action points, so it's actually more action point efficient than pretty much all the other handguns in the game, which is rather surprising. It does have pretty short range, though. It has the shortest range out of any of the handguns at only 15, which is 10 less than a 10mm pistol, so you do have to be fairly up close and personal with the 44 Magnum. However, if you do have this setup, it's very powerful in those ranges. Like indoors, it's really strong. It can even rival something like the double barrel, potentially even better than it, since ammo is a little bit more efficient for the 44 just because of the amount you can buy, and that is a little bit cheaper than something like shotgun shells. It also weighs a little bit less. So the 44 Magnum, if you want to grab this thing early on into Fallout 2, was actually a very solid weapon. It did require 5 strength in order to wield, which is one of the highest out of any of the handguns, but that's still pretty manageable by pretty much any character. So long as you had the caps to actually get it. It was rather expensive, at least for the start. It was like $2,000, at least if you had lower barter. If you had higher barter, it could be better than that. And this was actually one of the first weapons that could actually be upgraded in Fallout 2 as well, where this one did get a speed loader on it, which for some reason also gave it extra range. I don't know why that's a thing, but it went up from 15 to 20, so it actually had pretty comparable range to most of the other handguns, which was pretty good, and it also took 1 less action point to actually reload it. The 44 Magnum would show up once again in Fallout Tactics, and this time it was actually named after the gun that it was modeled after, which is the M29. This is most commonly known as the Dirty Harry revolver, because this is modeled after a Smith & Wesson Model 29. The 44 Magnum was, again, another very early game weapon, which was rather surprising, where this one you could get within, I think, the second level of Fallout Tactics. I think there was only one in that mission, but still it was a really good gun to get early on. This one was a little bit weaker than the one in Fallout 2, which isn't too surprising since you could get this one even sooner. This one did 14 to 21 damage, averaging about 17.5 damage. Other than that, its stats were very similar to what they were in Fallout 2, which made it a really good weapon to be using early on because it was actually more action point efficient than something like the Desert Eagle, which was slightly higher damage than this, as well as it had slightly longer range. But if everybody has 2 guns in that and you're only using this at close range, this works really well as a close range option, at least in the early game of Fallout Tactics. It would fall off a bit later. The one in Fallout 2 honestly stuck around for quite a while. If you wanted to use it, it was still really good, up to about 3/4 of the way through the game, I would say. The 44 would later show up in Fallout 3, and this was pretty much the endgame revolver, or just the endgame handgun in Fallout 3, because it was the strongest handgun in this game by quite a bit, with really the only other weapon, or at least handgun, that kind of competed with it, at least the ballistic ones, would be like the dart gun, and that was just because it had so much more utility than all the other ones. Some of the other weapons, like the alien blaster, could actually outdamage the 44 Magnum. The 44 Magnum in Fallout 3 was also the first time that it showed up with a scope on it, which is kind of surprising since this one is also kind of a reference towards Mad Max, because at least in the second Mad Max movie, we do actually see a 44 Magnum with a scope on it that is used a little bit throughout the movie. This would also later be referenced in Fallout New Vegas in terms of a challenge, which we'll talk about here in a second. The 44 Magnum would be a very powerful handgun. You could find them pretty commonly throughout the Wasteland, surprisingly, in Fallout 3, and they were always solid. They were also one of the few weapons you could actually ADS with, since it did have a scope. There was also 3 different variants of the 44 Magnum in Fallout 3, where you had the Black Hawk, which you could only get as a quest reward, and that was if you did the bonus from the quest and you specifically asked for it. because there was an option to not ask for it and get extra good karma, but the Black Hawk was just more powerful than the 44 Magnum. Pretty sure the Black Hawk is a play on the Ruger Red Hawk as well. At least I think it's the Red Hawk. I get them kind of mixed up, or maybe it is a Ruger Black Hawk. I think there's actually both. I don't remember which one is the 44 version, though. There was also Callahan's Magnum, which is a direct reference to the Dirty Harry movies, since it's Harry Callahan, and you could get this one from the Broken Steel DLC, but in order to get that one, you actually had to blow up the Brotherhood at the end of Broken Steel, and then you had to loot the crate at the very bottom of their destroyed bunker, destroyed Pentagon, really. Then you could get Callahan's Magnum, which was the strongest handgun outside of, like, the Alien Blaster. And a couple others, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Callahan's Magnum just did the highest amount of damage out of these. It had extra crit chance. It was very powerful, but it was a very late game item, unless you were planning on just playing through the regular campaign and then Broken Steel, and then you were going to go back and play through the other DLCs and play through like the other side quests. Usually, I would be saving Broken Steel for the end, so I didn't use it all that much in Fallout 3. There was also one additional revolver in this, which was Poulsen's revolver, which came from the Mothership Zeta DLC. And this one you could get from Poulsen himself. If he managed to die, you could take it off of his body. And this one was the strongest ballistic handgun in the game, and just the strongest handgun in the game, realistically, because even though this one does very similar damage to the regular 44 Magnum, it doesn't really matter since it counts as a shotgun. So every single pellet, I guess, every split part of the bullet or whatever the heck is going on with this gun, can potentially hit a crit, and each of those crits can add up together. So it can do way high crit damage. It can out damage all of the other handguns, even with very low luck. I think the only one that it really can't would be like the Alien Blaster, but that one's limited by ammo anyway. And even then, I still think with high luck, it would still probably outcompete the Alien Blaster overall. This one didn't have a scope on it, so you couldn't ADS with it, but that wasn't really necessary since it was a shotgun. You were going to be using it at close range. This was arguably when the 44 Magnum was the strongest, but that's just because Poulsen's revolver was pretty busted. It's pretty much always been a strong weapon. In Fallout New Vegas, the 44 Magnum would once again make its appearance, and in New Vegas, this one would have a challenge associated with it, where it was kill so many raiders with any of the Mad Max weapons. The 44 Magnum was probably the easiest to do this with out of any of the weapons, except for maybe a melee or an unarmed character, which you could probably just beat things to death pretty quick too. Either way, though, this was your best ranged option, since I think your only other ranged option was the sawed-off shotgun, which doesn't have a whole lot of range. The 44 Magnum would actually be the highest durability handgun in the game. It already had pretty much above average stats in just about everything in New Vegas, where it did good damage per second. It had average gun and strength requirements in order for you to wield it effectively. It had pretty good iron sights on it. It didn't use too many action points. It had decent enough spread. It had pretty fast follow-up shots. It was a bit heavier than other handguns. The 44 Magnum round was pretty versatile in New Vegas since you could load in different ammos. You could also do that in Fallout 2 and Fallout Tactics as well, which is kind of cool. Things like armor-piercing rounds can be a little bit more useful. In the case of the 44, you get the semi-wad cutter rounds, and you didn't even need a perk for that one. That one specifically, you did have to pass a survival check, I believe, or was it guns check? One of the two. And you also had to have enough repair in order to make it. But that was actually really strong. It also had 2 upgrades where it got a nickel frame, which was really good because that actually made it so it did have the most HP out of any of the handguns, where it had something like 325 HP, which is very high for a handgun. Most of the other ones don't have that. Something like the Ranger Sequoia, to put in perspective, has about 80. So this one would take much longer to break, and this one also could have a scope on it if you would like to put a scope. This was also one of the most powerful weapons that you could sneak into areas as well, since you couldn't really go up to like the hunting revolver. That one was too big to sneak in, but you could go all the way up to a 44, assuming that you had 50 sneak to get into any of the casinos or the hideout areas. That made it so the 44 Magnum was incredibly powerful in those areas because there wasn't a whole lot else that could kind of compete with it in terms of damage and damage per second. And there was also one unique 44 Magnum in this, which was the Mysterious Magnum, which is a lot of people's favorite handgun in New Vegas, and I do understand why. It does look really cool. This is a silver handgun with a pearl grip on it, and this is heavily implied to be the Mysterious Stranger's Magnum. Now, it doesn't do as much damage as the Mysterious Stranger can do, depending on what enemy that you're shooting, but it's still very powerful. It does more damage than a regular 44. It has better spread, it has better action points, still holds 6 shots, still reloads quite quickly, still has pretty good iron sights. It does have substantially less HP than the regular 44, where the regular 44 starts out at 250, this one's at 150, so it will break a lot quicker. That's still decent HP for a handgun though. It's just it's not going to be as crazy as the 44 can be if you have like the frame on it where it just takes forever to break. This one also plays musical chords whenever you pull it out or put it away, which is pretty awesome. I know a lot of people really love that part of this gun, and it does make sense. This is a really cool handgun, and it's a very powerful handgun. The 44 would once again make a return in Fallout 4, as well as Fallout 76. I should include that, even though I haven't played 76, which is why I usually don't go over them in these videos. And this one was once again one of the few handguns that I didn't really have a problem with in Fallout 4. A lot of the guns in Fallout 4 I don't really like the designs of, but the 44 Magnum, although it looking pretty chunky, still looks pretty correct for the gun that it's trying to be. So this one had quite a few mods on it. It was, again, pretty much the highest damage handgun in the game, and kind of stronger than a lot of other guns. Like if you built full damage with pistols and full damage with rifles, you convert like the bolt action hunting rifle into a 50 cal and make it as strong as possible. It still doesn't get as strong as the 44 Magnum can be, which is very bizarre. I don't know why that's the case, but either way. The 44 Magnum was very, very powerful in Fallout 4, and you could get quite a few of them. There were a couple places where they were guaranteed spawns too. And it was actually a very solid handgun. There was also a couple different unique variants of this, where you had Eddie's piece, which gave you extra limb damage, a decent effect overall, and wasn't too hard to get. You could get Kellogg's pistol, which gave you action points refill on critical hit. I don't remember exactly which legendary effect that is, but that one was kind of nice. And you could also get the Gainer, which you could run and get this one right away, and this one had fire on it, so you did 15 points more fire damage. That one was probably the best one to run and do, since it was just behind like a very easy to solve puzzle, and you had a legendary revolver that was pretty strong, so if you got some 44 rounds for it, you could do quite a bit of damage. There was, of course, better legendary effects for this, other than these. Something like Instigating or something like Two Shot would be really, really good. But these ones were all pretty solid effects. There was also the Western Revolver, which is a little bit closer to the original revolver from the Fallout games, even though it's using the same model. It looks a little bit more like the M29. You could get this one in the Nuka World DLC, as well as you could potentially get legendary variants of it, which it was one of the best ones to get legendary variants of outside of the DLC, since you used the 44 Magnum round again, so you didn't actually have to go to the DLC to pick up those ammos in particular. Things like the AK, where they used the 7.62 and nobody sold it, at least without mods. So it was kind of nice to actually get a Western Revolver. This one did even more damage than the regular 44 Magnum, which was already pretty high, so this one was pretty much the best handgun in Fallout 4. It had good stats across the board, still held 6 shots. It didn't have too many upgrades for it, but the upgrades it did have were quite strong. And again, if you could get some powerful Western revolvers, you were pretty set. I think on my last run of Fallout 4, or maybe it was my run on London, I ended up getting like a Mighty Western revolver fairly early on, and that kind of carried me through the entire game because it was pretty strong. Maybe not as overpowered as it could be if I got like Instigating or Two Shot, but still very, very strong overall. I do know that both the 44 Magnum and the Western Revolver appear in 76, and they seem to have very similar upgrades to what they would have in Fallout 4, so I would assume that they would also be quite powerful overall. The 44 Magnum has been very solid since it came out. In Fallout 2 it was really good, especially with how early you could get it. It did make it so fighting things like the Slavers were a whole lot easier if you wanted to go to war with them. The 44 was actually very solid. It stayed pretty solid all throughout the series, either being a very good early game weapon or being a very good late game weapon. I don't think in any of the Fallouts the 44 was really all that disappointing. At the very least, it was good when you got it. How do you enjoy this weapon? I know for a lot of people it's one of their favorites, really, in any of the Fallout games. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye, everybody!